You already know that the Crustacean Nation have a very robust campaign, but what about the roster? Can they pinch victory from the claws of defeat, or will they be condemned straight to shell? Let's take a look and find out. And if you want to take a look at these videos without any ads, then become a channel member for just $1 a month. All the same videos, but 0 ads. Check it out at the join button below, and now onto the crabs. First up, we have King Crab. He's a pretty standard frontlines battler, doesn't have a lot of armor piercing, so does best versus less armored targets. Eventually, he unlocks a number of decent support abilities to get a little bit more value outside of just fighting, but he'll always want to be either in or very close to the front lines to get value. He can have a Royal Spider Crab mount. This gives him more speed, armor and charge bonus. It means he can now do well versus enemy backlines if you wanted him to, but I'd still keep him close enough to your front lines to use his abilities. And he can use Shellworth, the Royal Throne Carrier. This drops some speed and defense to gain buffs to basically every other stat. He's now a massive high damage monster with decent toughness from all that armor, still vulnerable to range with the giant hitbox of course, however does grant allies attack and magical damage, so a pretty good upgrade. Reef Speaker is pretty much a basic spellcaster, so not a lot of use outside of this. Still fairly armored and has okay damage, but I'd just keep him back in casting rather than risking melee, just to be extra safe. The Law of the Shell is the first of 2 new laws and has a focus on support with augments, healing and hexes, with a little bit of damage sprinkled in here and there. His abilities grant even more value with buffs, summons and damage. His Barded Spider Crab mount grants him more speed, armor and charge bonus. I'd still use him the same and still avoid actual combat, only now do it faster. His Giant Reef Snapper, however, drops some speed and a little bit of defense for increases to almost everything else. He's now a fairly large monster capable of doing great work in melee alongside casting. The only downgrade is the increased size, so be wary of ranged or getting pinned down in melee. Old Kelpbeard is a powerful melee monster with great toughness and damage. He can do great work on the front lines alongside making use of his mix of the laws of Shell and Claw. His spell mix gives him plenty of damage alongside powerful augments and hexes, and his abilities weaken enemies and empower himself. Tide Lord Arthron is a strong frontlines lord with good damage and toughness. Pretty simple lord, just get him into melee against whatever you like and he'll probably do well. The only downside is his smaller size, which means he can easily get trapped inside blobs of enemies, so as long as you avoid that, he'll put in work. He also has several abilities to buff himself and allies, enhancing his melee power even further. His Azure Fang mount grants him more speed, armor and charge. Basically his own Spider Crab, so can do the same job but now move faster. Claudie's Beast Slayer is a pretty versatile lord with some short range but decently damaging missiles. They're not overly armor piercing but will do a good chunk of damage to whatever they hit. In melee he brings a ton of armor piercing and poison damage to tear enemies apart and weaken them whilst he's at it. His abilities allow him to pin enemies in place and throw highly damaging spears from a range. He's a great hybrid weapons lord that excels in either position, it all depends on what you're up against. The Crustacean Nobles are pretty much weaker versions of King Crab, less melee stats, damage and HP, and they swap his powerful abilities for something more generic. Not bad but fairly weak lords, with access to a Royal Spider Crab mount. The Crustacean Warlords are weaker versions of the Tide Lord, still decent armor piercing melee lords, just not quite as strong as the man himself. Still has some decent buffing ability, but are otherwise straightforward melee battlers. A decent choice if you want some melee power in your army leader. They can make use of the Barded Spider Crabs and the Giant Dragon Shrimp. These drop some armor and defense from the Spider Crab but gain a lot of speed, flight and a little bit of damage. If you want a breath ability and the ability to fly and don't mind the larger hitbox, then it's a great choice. The Crustacean Prophets have slightly less armor than Reef Speaker but otherwise the exact same without all his unique abilities. They can choose from 2 laws of magic, either Claw or Shell. As I said earlier, Shell is more support focused and Claw has a little more focus on damage and offense. Both are plenty strong, so it all depends on what you want. They can make use of the Barded Spider Crab and the Crustacean Battle Altar. This drops a whole bunch of stats without getting much back, however they can make use of a choice of 2 battle hymns to buff nearby allies, damage or defense. Coming to the heroes, we have Glacius Rhymeshell, pretty comparable to a Warlord in terms of melee power, however now comes with the Law of Fire for a ton of added value. Not much to say other than a good frontlines battler with access to a very powerful Law of Magic. He can make use of a Barded Spider Crab or the Northwind Queen. This is pretty much just a dragon shrimp with a unique name, treats it as such and you can't go wrong. Hummus Boys is still a strong frontlines battler, though not quite as good as Glacius. They have armor piercing damage and decent melee stats, so can fight most things and do okay. Just don't get too excited as he still works best as part of a team, rather than carrying it. He also has a number of rat related abilities for more damage and stat boosts. The Crustacean Royal Guard Captain is essentially a weaker warlord, so treat him as such. Get him into melee and they'll do pretty well. They can make use of a Royal Spider Crab. The Crustacean Mage Priests are like the Prophet Lords but even worse in melee. Still avoid melee whenever possible and choose one of their powerful laws of magic and you'll be fine. They can make use of a Barded Spider Crab mount. The Hardshell Champions are very powerful massive melee battlers. They come with high armor piercing damage, decent melee stats and very tough armor. Throw them into the front lines and watch them rack up kills in moments. And lastly, the Queen Crabs, which are like a slightly weaker noble who themselves are pretty weak. However, the mix of laws of high magic and shell is not quite as weak and makes them into very powerful support casters. Not the most damage potential, but if you want to empower the rest of your army, they will do that in spades, and they can make use of a Royal Spider Crab. Coming to the melee infantry, first up we have the Crab Levy. They're a pretty weak melee unit that's more here to get in the way than rack up any actual damage. Weak melee stats, leadership and damage, but half decent armor. They need something else to come in and do all the damage for them, but will keep enemies still to accommodate this. That combined with their low price makes them a more than acceptable early front line. Crab Warriors see stat improvements more or less across the board from the Levy. They're a competent line holder with strong defense, but still not much damage. Especially against any kind of armor, they will struggle, so again, something else will need to do all the damage for them. Spear Crab Warriors drop a little attack and damage to gain defense, bonus versus large, and charge defense. May as well go for a full front line of them for the most defense possible, since damage won't be anything crazy from either of them. Ironclaw Warrior Monks drop some entities and armor to gain a range of stat improvements. They're decently strong in melee with improved but still not fantastic damage as far as armor piercing is concerned. However, their secret weapon is their Ironclaw Resolve passive, which vastly improves their damage and armor as long as they're above 50% leadership. Keep them confident, give them support, and they will get you a ton of value. Crustacean Rangers compared to Spear Warriors drop a little bit of armor and defense, but otherwise it's all improvements. More attack and a little more damage combined with some physical resistance makes them an improvement on the same formula, but hardly a trailblazing unit. However, Vanguard and Stalk make them pretty good at sneaking around for flanks, or simply avoiding missiles, so they're not half bad. The Crustacean Royal Guard compared to Warriors drop a few entities but only really gain stat improvements to everything but speed. They're a very tanky front line with excellent melee stats and armor. Damage is still a little lacking, so they'll still need help, but they'll hold the line for an ungodly amount of time, so give you plenty of time to send it. The Halberds Crustacean Royal Guard drop some attack and damage to gain more defense and a better armor piercing split. Again, probably the best option as they have the best defense but now also come with more armor piercing damage. Will still need some help but also rack up a few kills for themselves. The Disciples of the Claw have a very small entity count but pack a punch in their limited numbers. Coming from Ironclaws, it's improvements to everything but speed. Their attack and armor piercing damage are fantastic, allowing them to rack up a ton of kills in no time, especially with the Ironclaw Resolve. The only downsides are the defense and armor, which are definitely lacking, making them into somewhat of a glass cannon. The Disciples of the Shell inversely drop most of that attack and damage to gain much more armor and defense. They are extremely tanky, but will do basically nothing against armored targets, even with that passive boost. If you want line holders you can support with other units, these are the way to go. If you want front lines to be the damage, go with claws. From the ranged infantry, we have the Crab Levy Slingers, pretty much what you'd expect from the name. A little bit weaker than the regular Crab Levy in melee, but come with some fairly weak range damage to make up for it. One thing to note for most of the ranged units in this mod, I'm not really sure why, but their animations and missile trails hardly ever appear, so it looks like they're doing nothing, but I promise you, they are. These guys do okay at providing added support, but against anything with a modicum of armor, they will really start to struggle. Useful for early game support, but want to be replaced as soon as you can. The Crustacean Bombers are a little better melee-wise than the Slingers, but the ranged is a whole lot more interesting. Far less range and ammo, but now they're sporting explosive fire damage. The stat card always undersells explosive damage like this, as it struggles to show how much damage this can do in a cluster. Aim this at a clump of enemies, and it will tear them to pieces, as well as throwing entities every which way. Of course, once enemies have a bit more armor, it starts to lose some impact, but these will do far better than you'd think from the stat card. The Crustacean Gunners keep the same melee stats as bombers, but trade the bombs for medium-range armor-piercing guns. Of course, guns means they need a straight line of sight, but lucky for them, crabs benefit from the same thing as dwarves. They're all really short, so you can pretty easily shoot over the heads of your front lines, depending on what they're shooting at. The damage here is decent, but nothing out of this world. They'll do well versus early game armored units, but into the late game, they will start to fall off as they simply cannot keep up with how tough enemies can get. Still, while they're good, they're great, and one of your first early units with armor-piercing damage, so expect to see a lot of them in your campaigns. Next, the Javelin Crab Warriors. Compared to the melee warriors, they're not that much weaker, and come with the titular javelins. These grant them some short range but decently damaging range damage, with a bonus versus large. They're similar to Norscan Javelin Marauders in that sense, and work excellently against early larger threats, especially the less armored ones. The shorter range does put them at risk, but the firing arc and focus on large targets means they can still stand behind front lines no problem. Plus, if they do get caught in melee, as I said, they're not half bad. They're not half good either, so still avoid it if you can. The Crustacean Grenadiers are a little tougher than the Javelin Warriors, but have similar damage to bombers. The range damage increase is minor on paper, but as I said, grenades are woefully undersold on stat cards. Use them the same as bombers against enemy clumps, and they'll do just fine. Next up, Crustacean Slingers, back to where we started in terms of the type of range damage. Similar melee power to Grenadiers, but somehow worse and a little faster. However, we're back to some decent range, ammo, and not much armor piercing. They're the safest ranged units to use with their range and arc, but the damage is quite lacking. They'll do okay versus less armor targets, but against armor, they're extremely weak even with their triple shot volleys. The crabs aren't an overly ranged infantry focused faction, and these are your proof of that. They will do okay versus specific targets, but shouldn't be relied upon as your main source of damage. From the cavalry and chariots, we have these spider crab riders. These are pretty much what you'd expect. Very fast moving charging cav with a good chunk of damage and charge bonus. Sustained melee stats are pretty poor, so avoid that as much as possible, but otherwise they land with good impact, especially early on. They have quite a lot of mass, so their charge is actually way better than the stat line would have you believe, as it tosses enemies all over the place on impact. So all in all, fast moving, high mass, and decently damaging shock cav. The Crustacean Knights are pretty much an upgraded version of the Spider Crab Riders. They drop a tiny bit of speed, but everything else increases, including a huge boost to charge bonus and damage. Melee stats are much improved, but I'd still stick to charging to make the most of that bonus, if nothing else. Can still be used just the same, so enough said. And lastly, the Crustacean Royal Knights. These drop a chunk of charge bonus to gain some improved melee stats and a much improved armor piercing split, along with a bonus versus large. This results in a unit that can do some great charges alongside being half decent in sustained combat, no matter how armored their targets may be. That armor piercing and generally being excellent all around unit makes them an easy choice for the best cav in the roster, and honestly one that might be a little bit too strong. In the monsters and beasts, we have Reef Snappers. These are kind of like wolf rats from the Skaven, so that means they're fast, pretty terrible in a fair fight, but walk straight through vulnerable back lines. Plus, they are outstanding at taking out retreating enemies, so are great as scavengers, finishing off anything already on the run. Back lines are the best place to use them, but the backs of the front lines can be a decent option, provided they're already softened up and won't be in fair combat for long. Against anything that can fight back, they are not the greatest, but if you choose the right targets, they are insane. Dragon shrimps are kind of like smaller but more numerous rotflies, and not just in how they look and are animated. They have an exceptionally high speed and flight, allowing them easy access to whatever they like, and most of the time, that's going to be backlines. Their melee stats are decent and their damage is pretty good, meaning they can walk through most backlines with ease. Their size and numbers mean they're not quite as effective as Reef Snappers, but with their stats they can take on larger threats, so it all depends on what you're going against. In fact, their stats are good enough that you could feasibly charge the backs of the front lines and break them pretty quick with their damage. The Hardshell Colossi are a pretty standard melee monster, great for beefing up damage on the front lines. Lots of armor piercing damage, decent melee stats, and pretty good toughness. Avoid letting them get picked apart from ranged, and they should do great. The Hardshell Bruisers are basically the same unit but better, can still be used just the same but now deal even more damage, and are even tougher. The Giant Reef Snapper is a huge single entity crab with excellent melee damage and decent toughness. It has a bonus versus large but does best in clumps where they can hit as many entities as possible at once. Same as the Hardshells, just avoid enemy ranged focus and it should do pretty great. The Great Dragon Shrimp is pretty much just a massive single entity dragon shrimp. It behaves just like them, but there's just one big one of them. It has excellent damage and speed alongside decent toughness. Its strong melee stats and armor piercing damage make the front lines the best choice, as the more enemies you can clump, the easier time it will have. Plus, you have Dragon Shrimp Breath, some added damage whenever you have a bit of distance. And lastly, the Ancient Leviathans are the pinnacle of the crab monsters, and it's literally just old Keltbeard but with no spells. Literally the exact same stats, so use just the same, only now focus entirely on melee instead of on magic. Next up, the missile monsters and beasts. First up, the Hardshell Cannonbacks. They drop a tiny bit of melee efficacy from the regular hardshells, but gain a ton of missile power. They have plenty of range and a nice chunk of damage best used against large targets due to the straight firing arc and lack of explosive damage. They can do great in the back lines, but their moderate speed means flanking isn't beyond the realm of possibilities. They can do great work and defend themselves pretty well, so I'd get them in every army I can. The Mortar Hardshell Cannonbacks drop a little bit of damage to gain even more range and, more importantly, a curved firing arc. This combined with their explosive missiles makes them excellent at devastating clumps of infantry, with the slight caveat that they will almost certainly hit your own units if they are anywhere close. The barrages from these guys are visually crazy and eviscerate enemies in no time. As long as you make sure more of the enemies are getting hit than your crabs, you can't possibly go wrong. And lastly, the Battle Platform Giant Reef Snapper. It's just as good in melee as the regular Reef Snapper, but now has a bunch of ranged weapons. It's got a Gatling gun on the front alongside a couple of bomb lobbers on the sides, making it truly devastating from a range and in melee. Getting on the flanks using that speed or just charge through enemies with ease, you can't really go wrong as it does work no matter where you put it. And lastly, the Artillery and Warmachines. The Crab Cannons are obviously your standard artillery piece that means basically no melee prowess but tons of ranged power. Massive range and very strong damage that is best used versus large targets, no explosive power and a straight firing arc make it very challenging to use versus infantry, so find the biggest enemy you can and fire away. The Crustacean Battle Altar is pretty much the same as the Mount for the Prophets. Same 2 abilities and same stat line, keep them at the back buffing troops and avoiding combat unless you find something exceedingly weak. The Shell Crackers drop range from the Crab Cannons but gain a lot more damage and rate of fire. That said, they work pretty similarly but now launch 7 projectiles at once. This simultaneously makes them better versus infantry but worse, as if you aim this anywhere near your own troops, they will 100% get torn to shreds. It's basically a birdshot artillery piece, so find the biggest turkey you can and get blasting. And finally, the Kraken Caller, a huge single entity mortar that launches magical projectiles over a massive range. Not only do these land with a ton of armor-piercing impacts, they also create Kraken vortexes, dealing follow-up damage and slowing enemies to a crawl. The only downside is the massive size and inability to drop the cannon to get the team to safety. If this thing gets caught out, it is a goner, so keep it safe and blasting, and you should have a great time. We also have some Regiments of Renown. The Rime Shell Marauders are Crab Levy. They have more entities, Frostbite and the Rage passive, which makes them tankier, difficult to get away from, and deal more damage. The Shadow Claw Assassins are Iron Claw Warrior Monks. It replaces Iron Claw for Shadow Claw Discipline, which doubles up the damage increases. The Iron Claw Council are Disciples of Claw and Shell, essentially combines both versions of Disciples, so you have crazy toughness alongside powerful damage. The Mirror Maw Outriders are Spider Crab Riders, gives them some limited ranged firepower in the form of some bombs. The Black Gulf Gladiators are Hardshell Bruisers, and they swap the bonus versus Infantry, Fun versus Large, and Terror. The Kraken Meister is an ancient Leviathan, and essentially puts the Kraken collar on the back of the Leviathan, making a damn powerful hybrid weapons unit. And Norseman Sturge are Crab Cannons and gain poison attacks. And of course we have the 3 Tide Lord units from the Tide Lord campaign. The Tide Guard Warriors are Crab Warriors, and they're a lot tankier in melee at the cost of little damage. However, they also gain some limited range damage to make up for this, alongside melee bonuses and Unbreakable while they're above 25% HP. The Tide Guard Slingers are like Crustacean Slingers, gain some armor alongside magical discouraging attacks. They also gain Snipe and Stalk, making them much stealthier, alongside a choice of missiles based on what you're going up against. The Tide Knights are the Crustacean Knights, and they gain Vanguard deployments alongside some extra armor and charge bonus. Slight improvements, but an improvement all the same. Now to wrap up with a mod review. Before I say anything about how good this roster is, I think I should just say that it is incredibly impressive it exists in the first place. This is a full-size roster based on a race of crab people, and every unit has a purpose and looks damn good doing it. Some actual races in the game can't say that, so I have to give the modders credit right out the gate. Now, as far as how good the roster is, well, I hope you devs have a praise kink because it honestly kinda rocks. Balance-wise is all over the place and extremely reliant on who you're up against, but fun and usability-wise, it is out of the park. You have viable units in pretty much every area of the roster. If you want beefy frontlines infantry, explosive missile power, or just a never-ending tide of monsters, you can have it all entirely within this roster. You're also getting 2 totally new laws of magic, and both are excellent with a distinct focus and great spells throughout. Everything works seamlessly in the campaign, and that side of things feels very balanced with their lower general income, meaning units are cheaper but still take some work to afford lots of them. Now, in battle balancing is a different story. These guys all being crabs makes them absurdly tanky with very high armor right from the early game. This makes battles a lot easier as no one really has the damage to take out your units, at least not anytime soon. Granted, this is a problem the dwarves also have, but at least they're pretty slow. The crab roster is also pretty speedy, especially considering their toughness. All of this crab boils down to a roster that is just the slightest bit overtuned, at least in my opinion. Especially once you get to the late game, they just get truly crazy. That said, auto-resolve takes a big steam on their shells, so it's only fair they have an easier time actually in battles. All things considered, I had a blast playing as the crabs, and it's one of the few times making videos that I've struggled to put them down so I could start making the video. Normally I'm playing just enough to get a feel before making some notes, but here I was getting engrossed and all it took was some wacky little crab guys. But what I want to know now is, what is your favourite unit in the crab roster? Are you a fan of their huge monstrous leviathans, or more of a reef snapper enjoyer? Let me know in the comments below, like, subscribe, and if you want more Warhammer 3 mod videos then check out this one all about the crabs in the campaign.